The wooden porch creaked under the weight of the stranger's boots, and when he knocked, the sound echoed across the empty plains like a gunshot. Dust swirled in the late afternoon sun, catching in the air like tiny sparks, and the wind tugged at the edges of the cabin's faded curtains. "I was told you need a man," the voice said, low and steady, carrying the weight of someone who had spent years living on the edge of survival. The words were simple, but something in them, the calm certainty, the quiet strength, made Ether, the woman of 30 who had kept this homestead alive on her own, freeze in place. She had lived here long enough to know every creaking floorboard, every warped board in the porch. Yet the figure standing before her was unfamiliar, imposing in a way that made her chest tighten. His broad shoulders were dust-streaked and sunburned, his boots worn, cracked, and layered with the color of dry earth. A wide-brimmed hat shaded his eyes, but not enough to hide the dark intensity that flickered there. Behind him, a boy peeked, cautiously, gripping the man's hand as if the world itself was too vast, too dangerous for a child alone. Ether stepped back instinctively, her large frame cutting an imposing figure against the doorway. Her hands, calloused from years of plowing, chopping wood, and hauling water, rested on her hips. The boy's dark eyes met hers for a brief moment before he ducked behind the man's legs again. He seemed small, fragile, yet there was a spark in him, a quiet defiance that reminded Ether of herself at his age. "You," she began, her voice uncertain, "you're looking for work?" But the man shook his head slowly. "No," he said, his tone carrying authority without arrogance. "I was told you need a man." His eyes met hers now, fully, unwavering, and for the first time in a long while, Ether felt something stir inside. Her unease mingled with curiosity, a strange pull she couldn't name. Behind him, the boy fidgeted nervously, glancing at her with wide eyes, the kind of eyes that made a person want to reach out, to protect. Ether narrowed her eyes, scanning him from head to toe. He was tall, his body honed from years of hard labor and survival, the kind of body that didn't just survive the plains but conquered it. His long black hair, pulled back into a rough braid, shimmered faintly in the sunlight, catching hints of chestnut in the streaks. Around his neck, she could see glints of metal primitive jewelry or charms, she couldn't tell. He carried himself with a silent confidence, the kind that suggested he had faced danger and survived. "Who told you that?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though her pulse had quickened. He shifted slightly, and the boy stepped forward cautiously, tugging at the man's sleeve. "It doesn't matter," the man replied. "All that matters is that I am here now." His eyes softened when they fell on the boy, a gentleness that contrasted with the rugged, warrior-like presence he radiated. Ether studied the child closely. There was a mix of fear and awe. A boy who had clearly been raised on the run, who had seen more than any 10-year-old should. And yet, there was hope in his posture, a quiet trust he placed in this stranger. Standing before her, Ether's mind raced. She had been alone for years, running this homestead after her parents passed and her only siblings moved on to towns where opportunity was rumored. She had fought off rustlers, survived harsh winters, and kept the homestead standing when others would have given up. But the presence of these strangers, one imposing, one fragile, was like a sudden gust of wind through a long-closed door, stirring dust and possibility alike. The wind shifted again, lifting her hair across her face. She blinked against the sun, noting how the boy's eyes seemed to glimmer in the harsh light, how the man's stance radiated both strength and restraint. Ether felt a strange twinge in her chest, a tension she couldn't place. She had survived the harshest elements, the loneliest nights, and the cruelest of people, but there was something about this moment, this knock, this stranger, that made her feel suddenly unprepared. "I don't know what you think I need," she said cautiously, "but I've managed on my own for a long time." The man's lips curved in a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Maybe," he said, "but sometimes surviving isn't enough. Sometimes you need someone who can stand beside you, and someone to protect what matters most." He gestured subtly toward the boy. "I can do that." Ether's heart skipped a beat. The boy peeked from behind the man again, and in that instant, she realized that this visit might not be a simple matter of work. It might change everything. The sun sank lower behind the jagged hills, spilling golden light across the cabin's weathered boards. Inside, the air smelled of pine, smoke, and the faint tang of dried meat hanging in the corner. Ether wiped her hands on her apron and studied the man and the boy, her eyes wary. The warrior, whose name she would later learn was Elias, leaned against the doorway casually, but his stance spoke of discipline and quiet strength. The boy, Samuel, peeked from behind his father's legs, curiosity flickering across his small, dark face. Ether took a deep breath, trying to keep her emotions in check. She had been alone for years, running the homestead without help, fending off rustlers, and surviving long winters. She was strong, capable, independent, but the arrival of Elias and Samuel stirred something she hadn't felt in a long time: uncertainty. And perhaps a glimmer of hope. Elias finally stepped fully into the cabin, boots raising small clouds of dust on the wooden floor. His eyes, dark and sharp, swept across the space as if measuring every detail. "You live here alone?" he asked, his voice low but not unkind. "Yes," Ether replied cautiously. "I manage just fine." Her tone was firm, but her gaze lingered on the boy. There was something protective in the way Elias held him, something that went beyond ordinary care. Ether felt a flicker of curiosity. Why had they come here, and why now? Samuel fidgeted, tugging at Elias's sleeve. "Papa," he whispered softly. The boy's voice was small, but it carried weight, a reminder of all the vulnerability and trust he placed in this man. Ether couldn't help but glance at him with a mix of sympathy and fascination. There was a quiet intelligence in the child's eyes and a cautious bravery that made her heart ache. Elias knelt slightly to meet Samuel's gaze, his rough hands resting gently on the boy's shoulders. "We're going to be all right," he said. "She's strong, Samuel." "Stronger than you think?" The boy's eyes flickered to Ether, and she caught a fleeting smile, hesitant but sincere. Ether's mind raced. She had faced plenty of men who claimed they could help, who promised protection, only to leave when the work got hard. But Elias was different. She could see it in the way he moved, the way he spoke, the quiet authority that didn't demand respect but earned it. And then there was the boy, fragile, cautious, yet clearly loved and shielded. The evening air grew cooler, and Ether moved to stoke the fire in the stone hearth. Sparks danced into the air, casting flickering shadows that made the room seem alive. "You'll need supper," she said quietly, trying to mask the nervousness in her voice. "You've traveled far." Elias nodded, settling onto a chair near the fire. "It's been a long journey," he admitted, "but not too long for a purpose." His eyes lingered on her as he spoke, and for a moment Ether felt the weight of his gaze, the kind that seemed to see past defenses and into the very core of a person. Samuel climbed onto a stool, his small fingers brushing the edge of the table. He looked at Ether, then at his father, and then back at her, as if weighing whether she was friend or foe. "Will she let us stay?" he asked softly. Ether's heart ached at the boy's words. She wasn't used to children, never had her own, but something about Samuel stirred a protective instinct in her. "We'll see," she said gently, though her tone carried an unspoken promise. For the first time in many years, Ether allowed herself to study the man before her, not just as a visitor, but as a person. Elias was weathered, muscles tensed beneath a simple shirt, his hands calloused but steady. Around his neck, Small tribal charms glinted faintly, catching the firelight. There was history in him, stories that had left their mark on his face, in his stance, and in the way he watched over the boy. The three of them sat in silence for a long while, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and a distant howl of coyotes across the plains. Ether realized she had been holding her breath without noticing, and when she finally exhaled, it was like releasing a small fraction of the tension she had carried for years. Somehow, in the span of an evening, the cabin that had been her fortress against the world began to feel different. The presence of Elias and Samuel brought a strange, unfamiliar warmth. Ether didn't yet know if she could trust them completely, but she knew one thing: the days ahead would not be the same, and perhaps, for the first time in a long time, she was ready to find out what that change might bring. Night had fallen over the prairie, and the cabin was bathed in the pale silver glow of the moon. Shadows stretched across the wooden walls, dancing with every flicker of the hearth fire. Ether sat at the table, her large hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, the bitter liquid warming her from the inside out. She stole glances at Elias and Samuel. The boy had finally relaxed, leaning against his father with the exhaustion of a long journey pulling him into a rare, quiet sleep. Elias remained seated on the floor near the fire, his elbows resting on his knees, gaze distant. The lines of his face were sharper in the lamplight, shadows emphasizing the years etched into his weathered skin. Ether had noticed the faint tremor in his hands as he traced the edge of the table, not from fear, but from the weight of memories he carried. "You've seen a lot," Ether said carefully, breaking the silence. She wasn't sure why she asked, only that the question had formed itself in her mind. "The way you move, the way you look. It's like you've lived through storms most people wouldn't survive a day in." Elias looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers. For a long moment he said nothing, then he nodded slowly. "I have," he admitted. "The plains, the trails, they're not forgiving. And neither are some people." His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of countless hardships endured. Ether leaned back, feeling the gravity of his words settle in the room. She had lived alone for years, surviving rustlers, harsh winters, and isolation, but she realized she had never truly understood what it meant to face the world with both life and death always just a step away. "And the boy?" she asked softly. "He's been with you all this time?" Samuel stirred slightly, his small hand brushing against Elias's arm. The boy's dark eyes opened, wary but curious. Elias put a rough hand over his son's shoulder. "He's all I have," he said simply. "And he's seen more than I'd like any child to see. But he's strong, he's learning." Ether's heart softened as she looked at Samuel. The boy was slight, yet there was a quiet courage in his posture, a careful observation that betrayed his sharp mind. He had survived hardship, yes, but with Elias at his side, he was beginning to understand what safety and guidance felt like. She felt an odd tug at her chest, a mix of sympathy, protectiveness, and something she could not yet name. Voice lowered, almost a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would summon ghosts from the past. "There were people, men with no mercy, who wanted what we had: land, supplies, even lives. I lost friends, I lost family. I've carried the weight of those losses every day. I've fought to survive, to protect him." His hand moved instinctively to Samuel's hair, smoothing it back gently. Ether felt a pang of understanding. She had fought to protect her homestead, yes, but she had never had a reason to truly fear for a child's life. Seeing the bond between father and son made her wonder how it might feel to be part of something bigger than survival. The fire crackled, sending a warm glow across the room, illuminating the worn wood of the cabin and the faint lines of exhaustion on Elias's face. Ether could see that despite the danger in his past, there was a deep integrity, a code he lived by even when the world around him was cruel. And in that quiet firelight, she realized that maybe she had underestimated the man who had knocked on her door just hours ago. For the first time, she dared to ask what had been pressing at her mind. "Why come here?" she said carefully. "Why this homestead? Why now?" Elias's gaze flicked toward the window, the moonlight casting his shadow long across the floor. "Sometimes the path you take isn't the one you plan," he said slowly. "We've been running for too long. The boy needs a place, a chance to grow without constant danger. And I need a chance to stop being alone. Maybe I was told you needed a man because this place, this cabin, it could be more than a stopover. Maybe it could be home for all of us." Ether sat in stunned silence, trying to digest the weight of his words. She had built walls around herself, strong and unyielding, to keep the world at bay. But hearing him speak, seeing the gentle care in his eyes for Samuel and the quiet strength he carried, she felt a small crack in those walls. The wind whispered outside, carrying the scent of sagebrush and distant earth. For the first time in years, Ether allowed herself to imagine a future where she wasn't entirely alone, where strength, survival, and perhaps even companionship could coexist under the same roof. As the fire burned low and the night deepened, Ether realized that the arrival of Elias and Samuel might be the turning point her life had needed. Danger still loomed in the wild plains beyond her cabin, and the road ahead would be far from easy, but in that flickering light, she felt a flicker of hope stir. For the first time in years, the cold, empty silence of her home felt as though it could hold warmth and perhaps even love. The morning sun climbed slowly over the horizon, painting the prairie in pale golds and dusty pinks. Ether stood at the edge of her porch, arms crossed over her broad chest, watching Elias and Samuel work in the yard. The boy was learning to carry water and stack firewood, his movements cautious but determined. Elias, ever patient yet firm, guided him with quiet instruction, his hands large and calloused, steady as the sun climbing in the sky. Ether felt a mix of curiosity and unease. She had been self-sufficient for years, yet watching Elias interact with Samuel stirred something unfamiliar: respect, admiration, and perhaps even envy. She had always handled her own homestead without assistance, but this man carried himself with a quiet authority that made her wonder how many battles he had survived beyond the prairie she knew. "Careful with that bucket," Elias said, his voice firm but gentle, as Samuel tilted it slightly and water spilled across the dirt. The boy's cheeks flushed, but Elias only chuckled softly, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. "It's all right, Samuel. Mistakes are how you learn." Ether's lips twitched into the faintest smile. The tenderness between father and son was stark against the harsh, sun-baked landscape. She realized that while she had been strong, she had never taught anyone else to survive with her. She had never shared the weight of labor with anyone but herself. Watching them now, she wondered if she was capable of letting someone in Dot as the Fia. Day wore on. Ether approached, carrying a tray with bread, dried meat, and a jar of fresh coffee. "You'll need more than lessons to survive out here," she said, placing the tray near Elias. He looked up, surprise flickering in his dark eyes. "You made this?" he asked. Ether shrugged, brushing her hands on her apron. "I've had practice. The prairie doesn't forgive laziness." Her tone was light, but beneath it was a subtle challenge. She had managed alone for so long, and she was unsure if she wanted or needed help. Elias glanced at the food, then at Samuel, who had already started picking at the bread with small, eager hands. "Thank you," he said simply. His eyes met Ether's, and for a brief moment, she felt a connection she hadn't experienced in years, a recognition of mutual endurance, mutual respect. Yet, even as the warmth of domestic life settled over the cabin, tension lingered. Ether had noticed the sheriff from the nearby town casting long glances toward her homestead over the past few days, his horse's hooves raising clouds of dust as he rode the distant trails, and rumors of bounty hunters always chasing shadows of the past seemed to drift on the wind like the scent of sagebrush. Survival was never guaranteed in the plains, and Ether knew that. "You should rest," Elias said suddenly, breaking Ether from her thoughts. "You've been working too hard." He nodded toward Samuel, who was now stacking firewood with careful determination. "It's not safe to carry everything alone, not when dangers are out there." Ether shook her head. "I've managed alone. For years, I don't need." She stopped herself, realizing her pride was clashing with an unfamiliar sense of caution. There was a protective edge in Elias's voice, one that implied more than idle concern. It made her uneasy, but also, strangely, relieved. Hours passed, and the afternoon sun grew harsh. Ether watched as Elias and Samuel finished the chores, their movements efficient and precise. She could see the bond between them growing, the trust forming in quiet gestures, the steadying of a hand, the correcting of a mistake, the shared glances that spoke more than words. By evening, Ether found herself on the porch again, a cup of coffee warming her large hands. She noticed how Elias's presence had begun to settle into her home like an unspoken promise. Samuel, now at her side, offered a shy smile and a small piece of bread. "I like it here," he said softly. Ether's chest tightened. She had never thought of anyone enjoying this rough, isolated homestead except herself. Yet hearing Samuel say it made her realize how much she wanted to protect them both, not just from the dangers of the plains, but from the loneliness and fear that had shadowed their lives. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of sage and distant earth. Ether glanced toward the hills, where shadows hinted at movement, wild animals perhaps, or the approach of strangers. Her heart beat faster. Life on the plains was never peaceful for long. But as she watched Elias speaking softly to Samuel and saw the boy's small hand grip his father's with trust, Ether felt something shift inside her, a readiness to face what was coming together. For the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel like a fortress against the world. It felt like a home, tentative, fragile, but full of potential. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of gold and crimson, Ether realized that survival alone had never been enough. Strength, protection, and perhaps even trust, maybe this was what she truly needed. Dusk settled over the plains like a velvet shroud, and the last golden rays of the sun streaked the horizon with fire. Ether stood on the porch, her large frame silhouetted against the glowing sky, listening to the rhythmic rustle of the dry grass. The wind carried a familiar, unsettling scent, smoke and iron, faint but unmistakable. Somewhere across the prairie, trouble was moving toward them, silent yet certain. Inside the cabin, Elias sat near the fire, his broad shoulders tense, muscles coiled like springs. Samuel huddled close, tracing his father's rough hands with small, hesitant fingers. "What is it?" Ether asked softly, her voice steady despite the tightening in her chest. Elias's dark eyes met hers, unwavering. "They're coming," he said. The words were simple, but the weight behind them made the cabin feel smaller, the shadows deeper. He had seen this before, men driven by greed, vengeance, or cruelty, closing in without warning. And they were rarely merciful. Ether swallowed hard. She had faced rustlers, storms, and the cruel whims of fate, but the thought of danger coming for this small group, this fragile little family forming in her cabin, stirred a fierce protectiveness within
her.
She would fight if she had to. She would not let them take what mattered. Outside, the prairie seemed to hold its breath. The distant thump of hooves grew louder, deliberate, uneven. Ether's large hands gripped the railing as she strained her eyes toward the approaching figures. Dust spiraled upward, catching the fading sunlight, forming ghostly columns that hinted at the shape of riders. Elias rose, moving with the quiet grace of a man who had survived countless ambushes. His eyes were sharp, scanning the horizon, and his hand rested on the rifle leaning against the wall. "Stay close to the boy," he instructed, his voice firm. "Don't let them see fear, and whatever happens, we stand together." Ether nodded, though her heart pounded in her chest. Samuel's small hand gripped hers, trembling slightly. "Papa?" the boy whispered. "They won't touch us," Elias said, crouching beside him. "Trust me. You've got your mamas. Courage, Samuel. Remember that." The riders were closer now, rough men on worn horses, their faces shadowed under wide-brimmed hats, rifles glinting as the sun dipped. They moved like predators, confident that the prairie and its isolated cabin would yield no resistance. But Elias's presence radiated something different, an unspoken warning that this homestead was not so easily taken. Ether moved behind the cabin door, her broad shoulders pressing against the rough wood, the rifle her father had left years ago within reach. She could feel her pulse in her throat, the tension coiling in her muscles. Every instinct told her that survival here would demand more than courage. It would demand strategy, vigilance, and unyielding strength. Elias signaled subtly to Samuel, positioning him behind a stack of firewood. The boy's eyes widened, but he nodded, trusting his father completely. Ether followed suit, keeping her large frame low, her hands steady despite the tremor of anticipation. The first rider approached the cabin, spurring his horse into a slow trot. Elias stepped onto the porch with the calm precision of a seasoned warrior. "This is our land," he called out, his voice carrying across the prairie. "Turn back, and no harm comes to you. Cross that line, and you'll regret it." The outlaws hesitated, exchanging glances. Their confidence wavered as the presence of Elias, broad-shouldered and resolute, became undeniable. They had expected easy prey, an isolated homestead with a lone woman and perhaps a child. What they didn't anticipate was the calm, lethal authority of a man who had survived far worse than a few desperate men on horseback. Ether could feel her heart hammering, yet beneath the fear, a strange calm began to spread. She watched Elias move, his rifle raised, posture unwavering, the boy safe behind him. Her pulse matched his rhythm. She was no longer just a bystander. She was ready to fight alongside them if necessary, her instincts sharpened by years of surviving the wild plains alone. The sun dipped further, painting the horizon blood-red. The outlaws muttered among themselves, unease spreading through their ranks. Elias's gaze swept the group, and in that moment, the power balance shifted. The predator and the prey had swapped places. Ether exhaled slowly, feeling Samuel press close against her side. For the first time in her life, she understood the weight of unity, of standing together in the face of danger. The threat had arrived, but so had their courage. And together, they would survive whatever the prairie threw at them. The sun hung low in the sky, burning orange and crimson across the horizon, casting the prairie in molten light. Ether's large frame leaned against the porch railing, muscles taut, eyes fixed on the approaching outlaws. Dust swirled in the fading light, cloaking the figures in a haze that made them seem almost spectral. Samuel clutched her hand, trembling slightly, but his dark eyes shone with determination. Elias moved silently beside them, the weight of a rifle in his hands. His posture was steady, controlled, every motion precise. The broad-shouldered warriors' long black hair caught the sunset like liquid shadow, the tribal charms at his neck glinting faintly in the fading light. He glanced at Ether and Samuel, a brief nod confirming that they would follow his lead, that they were a unit now, bound by trust and necessity. The outlaws had been confident at first, but now their approach slowed. They saw the readiness in Elias's stance, the calm that radiated like steel, and hesitation flickered across their faces. One of the men muttered something under his breath, the others pausing, uncertainty spreading through their ranks. The prairie, usually silent and forgiving, now felt alive with tension. Every blade of grass and twist of wind charged with anticipation. Elias stepped forward onto the open dirt, rifle leveled, eyes scanning the nearest rider. "You don't want this fight," he called out, voice steady, carrying authority across the open land. "Turn back now, and no one gets hurt." A brief silence followed. Then a rifle cracked from the edge of the ridge, the shot kicking up dust near the cabin. Samuel flinched against Ether, and she wrapped her large arms around him, pulling him close. Elias didn't move hastily. His eyes narrowed, muscles tensing. With a practiced grace, he fired in return, his aim precise and deadly. The sound echoed across the plains, the kickback steady in his hands. Ether's heart pounded, but she felt no fear, only a surge of fierce pride and trust. She had lived through harsh winters, rustlers, and isolation, but she had never seen skill and courage displayed like this. Every shot Elias took carried weight, purpose, and the unspoken promise of protection for those he loved. Samuel's eyes widened, the awe in his gaze reflecting both relief and admiration. Another rider surged forward, confident, thinking to intimidate them. Elias shifted, moving like a shadow, his rifle steady. He fired twice, the riders faltering, their confidence crumbling under the precise, unstoppable force before them. Ether could see it in their eyes, the realization that they had underestimated the man they faced. The outlaws had assumed vulnerability, but instead they encountered strength, skill, and unwavering resolve. Ether lowered herself onto the porch steps, still holding Samuel, her gaze unwavering. For the first time, she allowed herself to truly watch Elias not just as a protector, but as a man shaped by the wilderness, by survival, by loss and perseverance. She realized how much she depended on him already, how much Samuel did, and a stirring of something deeper, a bond that went beyond mere necessity, rose in her chest. The outlaws wavered, muttered among themselves, then finally began retreating, recognizing the futility of their attack. Dust rose in their wake, kicked up by hooves and the heat of the prairie. Elias kept his rifle trained for a few heartbeats longer, ensuring their departure before lowering it and exhaling slowly. His broad shoulders relaxed slightly, but the vigilance never left his eyes. Samuel, shaking but smiling, released Ether's grasp and ran to Elias, throwing his small arms around his father's waist. "Papa!" he cried, voice trembling with relief. Elias's arms enveloped him, steadying him, grounding him in safety. Ether watched them, a lump in her throat. The sight of this small family unit broken, tested, yet unbroken stirred emotions she hadn't felt in years: awe, longing, and the first faint glimmer of hope. Elias glanced at Ether, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You did well staying calm," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Not many would have." Ether nodded, her large hands gripping the railing. "It wasn't just me," she said. "We stood together." The truth of it settled warmly in her chest. For the first time, she understood that survival alone was not enough strength. Courage and trust could be shared. The sun finally dipped behind the horizon, leaving streaks of deep purple and gold across the sky. The prairie settled into silence. Again the danger gone, but the bond forged in fire and fear remained. Ether looked at Elias, at Samuel. and felt the fragile but undeniable pulse of connection, something that could grow into family, into belonging, into a life worth protecting. That night, as the fire flickered low and shadows danced along the cabin walls, Ether realized that the lonely days of survival were over. She had found not just allies, but something deeper: courage, trust, and perhaps even the possibility of love. The prairie was still wild. Danger still lurked beyond the hills. But for the first time in a long time, Ether felt ready to face it all, standing beside Elias with Samuel at their side. Together. They were no longer simply surviving. They were alive. The first light of dawn stretched across the prairie, painting it in soft golds and gentle pinks. Ether stood on the porch, her large frame silhouetted against the waking horizon. The night had passed quietly, the outlaws nowhere in sight, leaving only the lingering tension and the warmth of survival. Samuel sat on the steps beside her, yawning and rubbing his eyes, but the worry in his gaze had faded. Elias moved quietly behind them, long shadow stretching across the porch, his hands resting on the rifle more out of habit than necessity. The warrior's presence was steady, grounding, like the earth itself beneath their feet. Ether watched him, noticing the subtle relaxation in his shoulders, the faint curve of a smile tugging at his lips. After days of uncertainty, fear, and vigilance, there was finally a sense of calm. "You both slept well?" Elias asked, his deep voice low but warm. Samuel nodded eagerly. "Yes, Papa, I wasn't scared." His small hand slipped into Ether's, and she squeezed gently, feeling a protective surge wash through her. Ether nodded, allowing a rare smile to spread across her broad face. "We managed," she said. "Together." The words felt heavier than any she had spoken in years. Together. They were no longer alone, no longer just surviving. The bond between them had been forged in fear, in trial, and in the quiet moments of trust. Elias lowered himself onto the steps beside them, resting an arm on his knees. "It's a new beginning," he said, glancing at Ether. "The prairie can be harsh, but it's also honest. It tells the truth about who you are and who you can be." Ether's heart lifted at the thought. For so long, she had measured herself against hardship and solitude, believing that strength was enough. But she now understood that life could be richer, fuller, and brighter when shared. She looked at Elias and Samuel, realizing that she had found both safety and family in the most unexpected way. Samuel shifted closer to Elias, his small frame pressed against his father's broad shoulders. "Do we have to leave?" he asked softly, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "No," Elias replied firmly, one hand smoothing the boy's dark hair. "This is home now. This is where we stay." Ether felt a lump rise in her throat. For years, she had imagined home as a solitary place, defined by her strength and independence. But now, home meant warmth, laughter, and protection. It meant a shared life with those who had earned her trust, who had proven their courage and loyalty. The prairie seemed to breathe with them, the wind carrying the scent of sagebrush and fresh earth, whispering promises of long days and hard work, but also of hope. Ether could imagine the future now. Samuel running across the fields, learning the ways of the land from Elias. Her own hands guiding and teaching, sharing what she had learned over years of solitary survival. The thought filled her with a quiet joy she had never allowed herself before. Elias reached out, resting a rough hand on Ether's shoulder, his eyes meeting hers with unspoken understanding. "We'll face whatever comes next," he said softly. "But we won't face it alone." Ether nodded, her large hands covering his. The touch was steady, grounding, and for the first time, she allowed herself to feel something more than survival instincts or caution. She felt connection, trust, and even a subtle warmth that hinted at the possibility of love. Samuel climbed onto her lap, laughing quietly as he pointed toward the rising sun. "Look, Mama, the prairie's waking up." Ether hugged him close, inhaling the scent of dust, leather, and morning air. "Yes," she said, voice thick with emotion, "and so are we." The cabin, once a fortress of solitude and defense, now felt alive. Its walls held not just wood and stone, but laughter, protection, and the bonds of family forged in adversity. The sun climbed higher, illuminating the vast prairie beyond, golden and endless, promising days of work, learning, and growth. For the first time in years, Ether allowed herself to breathe freely. The warrior man who had knocked on her door, the boy who had followed him, and she herself, large, strong, and capable, had formed a family. Their lives were no longer defined by isolation or fear, but by trust, courage, and the quiet victories of survival. As Elias and Samuel began preparing the morning chores, Ether stood on the porch, watching the prairie stretch endlessly before them. A sense of peace settled over her, mingling with anticipation for what was to come. Whatever dangers remained in the Wild West, they would face them together. And in that moment, with the rising sun spilling gold across the land, Ether realized the truth she had long denied, that strength alone was not enough. Family, trust, and courage shared could turn a harsh, lonely world into something worth living for. Together, they were no longer merely surviving. They were home,